I realized that people are still coming, but so we'll start with, rather than just waiting, we'll start with some introductions as people arrive, and then we'll launch into the presentations that we have for today, just because we have limited time and fantastic speakers and don't want to, lose time. So welcome to our first New York Southeast Asia Network Public Universities Consortium panel or event of any sort for this semester. This is a panel entitled Getting There, Navigating Visas, Logistics, and Ethics of Research in and on Southeast Asia. I should express my thanks. I saw Margaret Scott in here somewhere, to the New York Southeast Asia Network, and prior to that point to the Luce Foundation for indirectly and then directly funding this initiative, and especially to Zheng Wang and the team of UAlbany students who have done all the work of organizing this panel. So you guys have done an amazing job. And of course, thanks to our fantastic panelists. So today we will hear from, and I'll do very brief introductions from 4 panelists. Oh, and I should say I'm Meredith Wise, Professor of Political Science at the State University of New York at Albany. And I work mostly on Malaysia, Singapore, and then bits on Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand. But our speakers for today, I'll give a very brief introduction, and then each of them will give a fairly short presentation with or without slides as they choose, and then we'll turn things over to Q&A. For Q&A, feel free either to raise a digital hand or to put your question in the chat. You can type the question directly to me and I'll read it out for you if you prefer, or you can just put it in the chat for everyone to see. You can also direct a question to a speaker, but then I won't know that there's a question on the queue. So that's probably not the ideal route unless you prefer that they respond offline. So first we'll hear from Rose Metro, who's at the College of Education at the University of Missouri-Columbia. She has a PhD from Cornell in Learning, Teaching, and Social Policy. And I have to say, is the first person I've met who has a PhD in Learning, Teaching, and Social Policy. She has worked as a Burmese, or does work also as a Burmese language interpreter, as a consultant for various international organizations. And she's worked with refugees, migrants, and exiles, especially from Burma or Myanmar, in Southeast Asia, and has done a lot more, an incredibly diverse range. She has 2 textbooks on teaching history, as well as a novel on Burma. Next, we'll hear from Eitan Paul, who is a PhD candidate in public policy and political science at the University of Michigan. His work is really policy-oriented political research on issues of accountability, representation, and so forth, in the distribution of public goods. Most of his work is in Indonesia as well as the Philippines. And he's previously worked with the Asia Foundation in Timor-Leste and with the National Democratic Institute in Cambodia on electoral reform projects. Third, we'll hear from Melody Shum, who is a PhD candidate in history at Northwestern and previously had earned her MPhil from the University of Hong Kong. She is writing on Vietnamese revolutionaries active in South China in the 1880s to 1940s, which I have to say, I've started reading little bits of this and it sounds really fascinating. But how that environment allowed them to build capacity and networks and evade French colonial control. And she's done field research, I believe, in both China and Vietnam, is that correct? Sorry, put you on the spot. Okay. And then finally, we'll hear from Ross Tapsell, who's a senior lecturer in gender media in the Gender, Media, and Culture program in the School of Culture, History, and Language in the College of Asia the Pacific at the Australian National University, which I hope I got correct. And he also directs the ANU's Malaysia Institute. He's done very extensive field research in Indonesia and Malaysia, also works in the Philippines. And he has a specific focus on media, particularly digital technologies, the transformations to the information landscape, and the role of disinformation and social media campaigning on the democratic process. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Rose.
Hi, everybody. So glad to be here. And thanks to you, Meredith, and to everybody else who organized. I want to start by just getting a thumbs up from anybody who does research in or around Myanmar or Burma. Anybody? I know Mary's here. Let's see, anybody else? A couple of other people. All right. So I am going to share my screen and present. All right, can y'all see that? So I have been doing research about Myanmar for about 20 years now. I focus on education. And I also have a particular interest in research practices and research ethics. So I'm going to talk today about these topics. I want to start with the colonial legacy of Burma studies as a discipline and the idea of access to a research site that's kind of assumed as an outsider. Like, we have a right to go there, we got to get the data, we being sort of like white Western people. And this is really the way that Burma studies was founded. And I think this legacy continues until today. Of course, there have always been people inside Myanmar who are doing their own research in their own ways and have their own networks. But when I first got involved with like the Burma studies community, it was not mostly people with origins in Myanmar. And I also want to acknowledge the complex situation that's faced by researchers who do have roots in Myanmar or neighboring countries, and just the connections that they have to navigate when they have friends or family members who are inside the country or around the country and might face different constraints, for instance, than someone like me would. I want to point you all toward a really great piece that came out earlier this year by Chu Mei Pai and Than To Ang, who are two scholars with roots in Myanmar, about kind of this colonial legacy of Burma studies and the role of whiteness in Burma studies. And I think one of their main points was that it's kind of like, we see you, it's not okay to instrumentalize people for the sake of your career. And that is very transparent to a lot of people in Myanmar and in the region. And that we want to find ways to do either research that's really ethical and respectful and involves reciprocity. So Myanmar is in a special situation right now because of the coup that just happened, which is obviously really unfortunate. I'm just remembering to set my timer here. So start. I'll just add a minute to that. And then the pandemic on top of that. So it's a really difficult time for people in the country, and obviously a difficult time to do research as well. It introduces a lot of complexity. So to start out, there really are not a central research authority body in Burma. And there was a great report I found about social science research that was put together just earlier this year. There's no national research policy. They say informality is prevalent. And I think anyone with experience in Myanmar and probably in the region more broadly is familiar with that concept of kind of just working your connections and personal relationships and not always having a clear answer as to who is granting permission and what they're granting permission for, and the details. That said, it's possible to work with disciplinary bodies such as the Department of Historical Research, who I've collaborated with before and participated in their conferences. So it's not that there's no research infrastructure in Myanmar, it's that it's not always centralized, it's not centralized, and it's not necessarily transparent. So right now, whoops, I skipped a slide, visas. So there's a travel advisory on Myanmar, and it's a level 4, which means do not travel due to armed conflict and also COVID-19. Also, they've suspended their e-visa program, which provided an easy way to sort of apply for visas online. So you have to go in person to the embassy or consulate. And I really have not heard back from anyone who has successfully gotten a visa to go to Myanmar in the past several months. So I don't have current information on that. Before this coup and COVID, you could get a business visa or a tourist visa. There are other categories of visa as well that people would use when they were doing research without getting an official research visa. And I have not heard about official research visas that you can get. I would say in general, it's not safe, wise, or feasible to do research inside the country at this point. But I am going to sort of walk you through a couple of alternatives. So when I did my dissertation research in 2008 and 2009, it was not possible for me to do that inside Myanmar because the topics I was talking about in terms of history were so politically sensitive that it was not comfortable for people to discuss them with me. So I did my work in Thailand on the border. And I see a move back to those borders happening now in research. A lot of my friends and contacts, both international and people from Myanmar, have now relocated to Thailand or other neighboring countries and are sort of continuing their work there as best they can. So Thailand, India, Bangladesh, or people can work in third countries. So for example, the US, Australia, the EU, places that communities from Myanmar relocated to, and there's a concentration of those people, you could certainly think about doing research there. People are also working with digital diaspora, so like connected groups of people, whether on Facebook or other social media platforms. I think it's possible to do research in those spaces there, as well as communicating digitally with people inside Myanmar. And there are obviously a lot of complexities to that in terms of security and making sure that people are okay, but it is technically possible. Another layer of this is IRB, or institutional approval, for projects related to Myanmar, which I have heard, from several PhD students that I've been working with, is pretty difficult to get right now. So IRBs might not be super informed about the intricacies of what's going on in Myanmar. And so they might just be like, don't do research on it at all. Like that's the easiest thing for us to do, or the easiest call for us to make. So because of that, it can also be difficult to get approval for these alternative location projects. So I have written about the gap between legal and institutional requirements and then ethical imperatives, and how those don't necessarily line up. And I think I wrote about consent forms, and how consent forms with the people that I was working with really freaked them out. They were not comfortable signing them. My university wanted them. And I ended up not using them, and then got this like magical dispensation from my IRB that I didn't have to because of the nature of my project. But there are a lot of concerns that come up when we're kind of asked to do certain procedures, follow certain protocols by our university, and they just don't match up with the needs that we see on the ground in terms of being an ethical researcher. So is ethical research during the current crisis possible? I would say it's difficult, but not impossible. And I think it's also important to point out that halting research about Myanmar is not necessarily an ethical thing to do. People want and need information, including people inside Myanmar. So I would say that if you were going to try to design a research project in or around Myanmar at this point, whether through digital avenues or being in an alternative location, it would be even more of a priority than usual to really do that in a participatory way and figure out what the people you're working with want to know and help them figure that out, and kind of do your research in service of the goals that they have. Definitely expecting that there needs to be reciprocity there. So not having an extractive model where it's like me coming in to get the data and take it out somewhere else, and then these people never see me again, even though they potentially put themselves at risk to provide this information, but rather involving people in the research process from the start, right, from our research design. There are also a lot of new resources coming out in response to this difficult situation that people who work in Myanmar are in. The University of California, Berkeley held a really good workshop on digital research ethics last March, and kind of about how recognizing this alternative research space that has opened up and thinking about how we're using that, and how ways that we use that actually might be unethical. Like, are we lurking on our Burmese friends' Facebook pages and then, pulling quotes without asking them, or screenshotting things that could later be used against them in some way? I think just as if we were doing in-person human subjects research, we need to be very conscious of consent. And it's a complicated thing, because people may not want to be acknowledged in our research. They may want to remain anonymous. They may not want to remain anonymous. We may have relationships with the people. We may not, if we're working in a digital space. A lot of things can come up. So I would just summarize by saying that there are not easy answers, and case by case negotiations would be necessary with attention to power dynamics and how our positionality affects our research, whether it's someone like me who's an American citizen coming from the outside, or whether it's a Myanmar researcher who's working with a community that they're part of. Yeah, I think it's really important to just have a community of people who can kind of be a sounding board for you and help you think through these issues. I have a couple of references to share that I talked about throughout the presentation, and I'm now going to stop my share. And yeah, so I'm looking forward to your questions if you have them afterward, and looking forward to hear what other people say.
Terrific, thank you so much. And Rose, may I ask, perhaps if you could paste those sources in the chat for people who might want them? I was quickly Googling myself, but okay, Eitan, next.
Great, let me also share my screen. Once again. Okay. All right, can you all see it?
Yes, but we're seeing the presenter view, actually.
Oh, whoops. How's that?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for inviting me and for the kind introduction. So I've done about 1.5 years of fieldwork in Indonesia over the last couple of years, mainly about community participation in village budgeting. I should start by mentioning that the visa process in Indonesia, I think like many, if not most countries, still is currently suspended. You can't apply for a new visa. I don't know when you will be able to. If there isn't a kind of big third wave of COVID, maybe in the spring, but that's just a guess. But you can apply already for a foreign research permit, which technically you are supposed to do even if you are doing research that is collaborative with local researchers. I'll put in the link here now before I forget. The official Indonesian research agency's foreign research permit office. So unlike Myanmar, Indonesia has an extremely rigid and complex research regulation process. So I'm going to provide some general tips to doing research in Indonesia, and then I'll give some specific details on all the steps involved in the research permitting process, and be happy to follow up with people later who may be actually going through this, because it can be quite challenging. So, okay, my first tip is to learn Bahasa Indonesia. So it is possible to learn Bahasa Indonesia quickly. I am now a 6th-year PhD candidate. I only began learning Bahasa Indonesia in my 3rd year, and I'm now professionally proficient. I can do all my interviews and meetings entirely in Bahasa Indonesia. I, studied very hard and did an immersion program in Indonesia, but it's possible. And most Indonesians, including those with higher education, are not fluent or necessarily even proficient in English. So your research will be better if you invest in learning the language. It's possible to learn it quickly. And also navigating the research permitting process will be easier, because a lot of the forms you'll have to fill out are only in Indonesian, and you'll probably need to be communicating via WhatsApp with local officials to follow up on things, and being able to do some of that at least yourself in Indonesian is super helpful. Do not do research on a tourist or sociocultural visa in Indonesia. So this used to be very common that people would do that because the official research process is so burdensome. But in recent years, the Indonesian government has been cracking down on this, and they have expelled several foreign researchers, professors, PhD students, and permanently banned them from entering the country. So don't try it. I myself, so I did everything, to the T, and I'm very glad I did for multiple reasons. One of which was during my field work, when I visited one village office, the village had actually called the local intelligence office and asked them to come and check to see if I was there legally and everything was okay. And it was, but the intelligence officer came and actually checked, and I had on me all of my permit documents. And it's a good thing that I did, because I could have been arrested and deported in that moment. It also, actually, because I did everything to the T, it allowed me to return to Indonesia during the pandemic, because I still had an active permit and multi-entry permit, which the only way I was able to get those kinds of permits was because I went through this whole process to begin with. So now you can't start the process from scratch during the pandemic to enter with a new visa, but there can be multiple payoffs to doing everything properly. Okay, so start early. So I would suggest, like, if you're thinking about potentially doing research in Indonesia, even like in the next academic year, start thinking about now who your partner university is going to be in Indonesia. You need to have a formal affiliation with an Indonesian university. It can be like a visiting fellow type of thing, but they're going to have to help you through parts of this process and provide multiple formal letters for multiple stages of this process. And I would suggest doing it with a well-known major research university in Indonesia, because I have heard from friends who have done it with smaller, local, less well-known universities that one, the university kind of administration was less helpful, but two, the Foreign Research Permit Office might kind of scrutinize more and take longer to process application materials from a lesser known university. So I am affiliated with Universitas Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta, which is one of the best universities in Indonesia, and they've been very helpful. So that's one university you might consider. Indonesia does not have complete academic freedom, despite being a democracy. So part of the application process is you submit your actual research proposal, and there is a committee that will convene and review the substance of your proposal, not just the technical aspects of your application. And they can deny for any reason the research. So some topics I've heard that are sometimes not approved are related to natural resource exploitation, LGBTQIA issues, conflict or separatist movements in Papua and West Papua. So that's not to say like don't research those things, but it's if you are going to, you're going to need to approach it with a lot of care. And I would suggest working early on with local Indonesian researchers who do research on those topics and ask them how they do it, how they get it approved, how they talk about it in forms that they submit to the Indonesian government. Okay, and then next, plan for your first full month in the field to be spent visiting government offices to process required permits before you can actually begin your research. That's not an exaggeration, and you'll see why. I'll go through some of the steps in a moment. So this can make it difficult to do just like a couple month trip. If you plan on doing actual data collection, interviews, survey, anything that involves, so like if you're just meeting with NGOs, you may be able to do a sociocultural visa, but if you're doing like data collection with ordinary citizens, with government officials, anything like that, you are going to have to go through this process that I'm about to explain, which involves visiting offices. I also suggest hiring a local research assistant. Cost of living and of hiring someone varies by location, but like in Jogja, for $14 a day, it's like very reasonable pay for a research assistant. It can be enormously helpful in your research in general and for navigating the process. So if you're partnered with a local university, they can help you find someone to hire. Okay, so the way that this works is you apply first to the Foreign Research Permit Office for a foreign research permit before you can apply for a research visa. And there are, so you can do it for different amounts of time. The way that I did it, the standard way, is 1 year. It can be renewed twice for up to a total of 3 years. The locations are, all the requirements for this are on the website, or most of them are. I'm going to highlight a few things that like to flag to make sure you pay attention to. One is include all potential research locations down to the district, like Kabupaten or city, kota level in your initial application, because what you put in your initial application is going to be used to generate letters to the local agencies that you'll then have to visit. And while it is possible to amend after you start, you have to, if you do amend it, you have to repeat visits to a bunch of government offices, which will take a lot of time. So there's no penalty to listing more locations than you actually do research in. So if you're thinking like, I'm going to do research in, probably 2 places out of this list of 10, just include all 10. Okay, next, you will need an MOU or a letter of agreement between your university and the Indonesian university. And it needs to be signed by deans or above, like a dean, a provost, vice president, can't just be a department chair. So leave a lot of time for that, because that's going to involve probably like legal teams, offices of international affairs at both universities reviewing stuff. So like in my case, yeah, navigating both University of Michigan and Universitas Gadjah Mada bureaucracies took quite some time for that. And you'll need letters of recommendation from your advisor and your department chair. You'll need a red background photo. If you do go to Indonesia first on a tourist visa or sociocultural visa, you can get a bunch really cheaply there. But that's like a unique thing Indonesia uses. Regular white background passport photos will not be accepted. So the cost of the foreign research permit is about $107. You pay it actually once you enter the country and pick up your documents from the foreign research permit office. Then they will create a telex, any embassy or consulate of your choice, to get the actual research visa, which I think the current cost is $150. And this, it doesn't have to be the embassy or consulate like where you're from. So I actually was doing some research in the Philippines while this was being processed, and I did this part through the Indonesian embassy in Manila, and that's fine even though I'm an American citizen. And this process is easier, it just takes a couple weeks. Okay, then once you enter the country and you pick up, so you'll get a research visa that says on it like 1-year visa expires in 30 days. So like that's confusing, right? What does that mean? It's because within the first month, you have to convert it into a limited stay permit. And in order to do that, you have to first do all the steps that I'm gonna quickly summarize now. You need to pick up the research permit documents and letters from the Foreign Research Permit Office. And then you need to go to the National Police, and then in Jakarta, and then you have to upload the letter you got from the National Police and a bunch of letters you got from the Foreign Research Permit Office to the Ministry of Home Affairs. That's going to take them 5 business days to process. Then you'll pick up from them a bunch of letters addressed to provincial and district governments where you'll actually be doing your research. And then you have to convert the visa into the what's called KITAS or ITAS, limited stay permit, which you'll do in the local immigration office. And to do that, in addition to all the letters I just mentioned, you need letters from the village office in the village where you're living. And they might require first letters from the neighborhood association chair or the hamlet head where you live, and a letter from the sub-district where you're living. You'll need another letter from your Indonesian university, and then you'll have to make 3 visits in the span of 2 weeks to the local immigration office to like drop off your passport and application form, come back for photos and fingerprints, and then come back to collect stuff. And you have to pay them another $180 for a 1-year multi-entry permit. Then you have to, so Indonesia has these Badan Kesatuan Bangsa dan Politik, which is like national political and union agencies in every province and district. And you have to report to them and get letters from them about your research as well. So the letters that you got from the Ministry of Home Affairs are for this. You have to do that. Technically, you're supposed to report to the provincial police also. And then depending on what kind of research you're doing, you might need to get kind of special additional letters. I did from relevant local offices. So like I was doing research related to village budgeting. So I was meeting with and requesting data from district level village and community empowerment offices. I needed letters from them and letters to them. And I also needed letters from village offices to go around interviewing people in villages. So happy to discuss that more and give tips more on that later. Now just a couple tips on if you're doing surveys in Indonesia. I suggest getting quotes from multiple survey firms. I've worked with LS Lembaga Survey Indonesia, Populi Center, Kata Data, and negotiate. Doing surveys in rural areas can be very expensive. So, think about like in the tens of thousands of dollars. If possible, do a pilot survey first. That's always a good idea, but I think especially in Indonesia can be really helpful. And if possible, monitor survey implementation yourself. So it is possible now to like potentially partner with an Indonesian survey firm and ask them to do a survey for you. But if you can wait and be there during survey implementation, that's much better, because quality of survey implementation, even by very reputable survey firms, can be really variable. And phone surveys are very difficult in Indonesia because there are basically no landlines, and people change their phone numbers all the time to take advantage of like SIM card deal. They'll just get new SIM cards with free data, basically. So there are no real directories of phone numbers of ordinary people or even of government officials. So it's possible to do certain kinds of phone surveys, but not super easy to get phone numbers. Okay, a few other suggestions. Meet with local researchers, NGOs, populations of interest before finalizing research design. That's always good practice. And I think the ethical thing to do will also make your research better. Especially with Indonesia, I think there's really not a lot of information on a lot of topics online. So you can really learn a lot by being there and doing some preliminary research. Involve local research partners in your research design, implementation, and in publication. You're actually also required by Indonesian law, if you're doing research in Indonesia, to do at least some joint publication with Indonesian researchers. And you'll want to prepare formal letters. In addition to the permit letters you get, you can do this in partnership with the local university to request government data. If you need any government data that's not already publicly available online, if you just like send an email to a government office, no one will reply. Even if you call them up, they will not provide you data, even data that's supposed to be publicly available. Like in my case, for example, village level election results or village budget related data. So you will need to provide them with your permit letters and like a specific letter that says like, I'm requesting this data for this purpose. And you or someone you work with will probably need to go in person, even if in the end of the day, they're just going to send you a soft file that they have on a computer. You probably have to go in person to kind of gain their trust first, or have an Indonesian associate do that. Another tip is Indonesians generally do not like using email, including in professional settings, including government officials. So it's not impolite to ask people for WhatsApp numbers of colleagues and of contacts that you want. So do your communication through WhatsApp to kind of try to expedite things, follow up with things, request meetings by WhatsApp, not by email. And I think this is my last one. Yeah, avoid personally conducting research in rural areas during election campaigns, unless you're researching election campaigns, in which case you're going to want to coordinate with local researchers and like local police early to let them know what you're doing, because there's a real sensitivity in Indonesia to like potential foreign interference in elections. So I was personally warned and had some discussions, even though I wasn't researching elections in rural parts of Indonesia, to that it would be better if I personally, as a white foreigner, really stands out to just not be there if I don't need to be during election campaigns, like local election campaigns. Okay, so that's it. I have my email here, and that's the website of the Foreign Research Forum. Oh, one last thing. So BRIN, the Research and Innovation Agency, is new. It used to be the Ministry of Research and Higher Education. They just reorganized in the last year, and the whole process I just described might change. So the new head of this agency has the legal authority now to completely change the process. And he knows that everyone hates this process and is considering changing it. But there's no timeline or specific commitment on how or when this might change. So just a heads up that like, if you're doing this a year from now, check on that website closely. And a lot of these things, unfortunately, well, or fortunately, it might get simpler, may change. So thanks so much. Happy to answer any questions. Sorry, I think I went over time.
It's good information, and it's making me, really appreciate my choice of working more in Malaysia. Okay, Melody, you're up next.
Hey, thank you. Let me share my screen. Make sure I share the right screen. Okay. So, hello from Paris. I'm Melody, and I'm a sixth-year PhD candidate and I work at Northwestern, and I work on modern Vietnamese history. So my project examines the history of the Vietnamese Revolutionary Underground in South China by following the trajectories of 3 generations of a revolutionary family from Nghệ An province in central Vietnam. And today's presentation mainly concerns how I came about doing fieldwork in the native place of these revolutionaries while I was in Vietnam from December 2019 to December 2020. So basically right at the heart of COVID. Right, so in terms of visas, I would say that if you are there for academic research, it is really important to get a student visa with a Vietnamese university because it gives you an official academic affiliation in Vietnam. And this is really important when you apply for approval to do research in places outside of Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City. And I will explain later why when I talk about the process of applying for permission to do fieldwork in the provinces. So before COVID, Vietnam also had a range of tourist visas for people of different nationalities. And I think if you are someone of Vietnamese descent, a Viet Kieu, then you are eligible to apply for a 5-year visa. So I know people who have done research using a tourist visa or a 5-year visa, but I would say that especially during COVID times, like foreign influences are heavily monitored. So you might get into trouble using a tourist visa to do research in the provinces since the police are quite aware of foreign presence. And if they find out that your existence in the province does not match the activities that you said you're going to do, like it might not it might not get really pretty. So that's really important. I think also, like what some of the presenters already said, it's very important to get a visa from a reputable university in Vietnam. So I would say any major national university in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City. I myself got my visa from the Vietnam National University, University of Social Sciences and Humanities in Hanoi. And I've had experiences of getting it from the Institute of Vietnamese Studies and the International Cooperation Office, which are both fine. And also the new School of Interdisciplinary Studies. My friend works there and he says it's actually easier with them because most of the researchers there are young and more open. So that is the new third choice, which is great for Vietnamese people who work on Vietnam. I don't know what the situation is now in terms of getting into Vietnam. But I do know that before they had military lockdown, there were French students who still got in while they were sponsored by their lab in the university. So that was early, sometime around January this year. So in terms of getting into Vietnam, they might be relaxing the restrictions, but I don't have the most updated information. And I would say that if you are planning to do archival research only in Hanoi or Ho Chi Minh City, then the university that sponsors your visa can also write a letter for you with a fee. But also another way to get around this is to ask foreign institutions that are based in Vietnam to help you write that letter. For instance, I had a fellowship with the École Française d'Escrime-Orient, the EFO, and they've been there basically since colonial times. And so they have a really good network of connections and all the archivists know them. So maybe getting the director there to help you write the letter would be easier to get in getting the university, and probably you don't have to pay for that. So in terms of finding local contacts and applying for permission to do research, so basically, I think the best thing to do if you're planning to work in the provinces is to find your local contacts through researchers based in Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City who've had a lot more experience than you have working in those areas and are much more open to working with foreigners. It's very difficult to simply cold call these local institutions without personal contacts. I was very lucky because the institution, the French institution that was based in, the former director already had contacts in the area I was working in, so I was extremely lucky. But the process of doing this is actually really hard, I think, if you don't have those personal connections. When it comes, and now it really comes to the most difficult part, which is, so getting to Vietnam, it's not that hard, but applying to do research in the provinces is quite annoying. Like it's not like it's not possible, but the process can get really annoying. At first, I thought that my experience of working in China could just I could just basically use the same experience and they'll be fine. But they're both communist countries. What could be wrong? But I was very wrong about it. The first thing I had to do was to come up with a very detailed research itinerary for my university in Hanoi, to write an official letter that could be sent to the local institute that's supporting my research in Nghệ An. The itinerary is extremely important, and there's a very delicate balance between being detailed and not too detailed. So the first time when I applied for permission, I wrote that I wanted to buy books in Nghệ An. And the feedback I got from the university was that I had to revise the letter because they wanted a list of every single book that I was going to buy in Nghệ An. And the thing is, if I knew what books I was going to get, then they probably were in Hanoi and I would need to buy them in Nghệ An. So I just basically took that out of my letter and resubmitted my application. Then basically, after my contacts get the introduction letter from the University of Hanoi, they would send this itinerary and the letter to the Sở Ngoại vụ, the Department of Foreign Affairs of Nghệ An province. And then this process takes a lot more time than you think. And usually all of it would be around 2 to 4 weeks, depending on, for instance, whether they give you feedback and say you need to revise this or that. And also, it gets really annoying when the province doesn't approve your trip until 1 or 2 days before you actually go on the trip. And apparently this is a very common practice in Vietnam. So my contact there was like, yeah, it's going to be fine. Don't worry too much about it. But it's still very nerve-wracking because I'm like, when do I book my tickets? When am I going to book my hotel? And they're like, it's going to be fine. But yeah, so the way how I think it's really like getting used to the way how things are done there. It's also a very important part of learning how to do research in Vietnam, because it could just always work in ways that you're just like, what is happening right now? So avoiding trouble and best practices. So for junior researchers who are just starting to do fieldwork in Vietnam, your police file is basically blank. And so the state doesn't really have a lot of records of you. And that also means that you will encounter a lot more red tape compared to a seasoned researcher. This is why having affiliation with a university is so important, because it makes you look legit. In a country where many people are organized by their units, it makes it much easier for the state to validate your identity and status in Vietnam through the university, which in some sense is your unit. My situation in Nghệ An was kind of complicated because I am, and some of you might know that, the Chinese and Vietnamese people don't necessarily love each other. And so I am an ethnically Chinese person from Hong Kong with a British passport. So I was warned by my local contact to always speak English and to never speak Mandarin in front of the villagers. And after an incident in which, there was a local police person who was very alarmed after there was an incident in which my assistant and I spoke Mandarin because I couldn't find an English assistant to help me translate on my first trip to Ia. And basically we were told off were basically scolded that that could never happen again, because the villagers there were very patriotic villagers, and so that was really alarming to them. Yeah, so basically, the police would also constantly check in with my local contact about my daily whereabouts. I was allowed to change my itinerary, but I have to first report it to my contact. And the funny thing is, when I was preparing for my second trip, my local contact told me that I needed to be more serious this time and not play around. And I didn't understand what she meant, because I was told by most researchers that on your first trip, you're just there to kind of scout for interesting things, and then you go back on your second trip to focus on the things that you actually find interesting. And what happened was, after we kind of talked about it, I talked about it with some of my local friends, and they were like, it might be because I chose to stay in the hotel instead of going places. And so basically, there was a blank in my schedule, and that it made it difficult for the police to write the reports. And that might be a reason why I was not supposed to play around on my second trip. And so the second time when I went, I made sure that I evenly spread out all my field work and to concentrate on doing research in one district. And then I did get approved, but the feedback I got was it's sensitive because I am spending way too much time in one place. I think one of the life-saving strategies in this situation is really to get a very experienced interpreter who is good at being the bridge for foreign researchers and local cadres and police. And if you can find someone who is from that province that you're going to work in, because regionalism is so strong in Vietnam that every province might have a different way of doing something. And there are just things that as a foreigner, you will never be able to penetrate. Like, so basically, having an assistant, like I managed to find someone, befriend someone who's actually a professional researcher. And what happened was that she was just amazing. She basically told me that the police should not have been calling me because they should have followed me. And instead, so they should have sent someone to go on the trips with me instead of calling my contacts about in my hotel about, oh, where's this foreigner now? Like, so basically, having someone experienced is so important because it's just so different every province that you work in. And I know I've talked a lot. Oh, not yet. So I've talked about like how it's very difficult sometimes when dealing with the police, but at the same time, it's like a really double-sided thing because it's actually better sometimes because if the locals know that you're on the police's radar, it's also less likely for them to bother you. Like they're also more cooperative. And I also think that one of the things that's really important is to bring hard copies of all the letters that you have from the university and also from the province, because even if they know that you have papers, they will still ask for them and they will still pretend that you don't have papers. This is why the first time I did it and I got yelled at, but yeah, I learned the hard way. So also it's important to try not to plan your trip too close to the end of the year because I didn't really have a choice because I was already scheduled to leave Vietnam in the end of 2020, but the local cadres and research contacts, the local cadres and my local research contacts would probably really appreciate it if I went earlier because December is usually the busiest month for people working in the public sector. And lastly, as a woman doing research in Vietnam, sometimes it can get a little uneasy because traditional gender norms are still quite persistent, especially in the provinces. And sometimes women have to sing and drink in a dinner party. And sometimes it's fun, sometimes it's not. And it can also get a little annoying when your local male research contact tries to pay for everything when you actually have a research budget. And then you get a phone call from his boss saying, can you find a way to pay him back? Because he's actually not financially very well off. So, and I'm like, how? Like, just kind of shove money to him. And so that was a really weird thing. And I think I had to have a drinking contest with him once to make him. And I was like, if I drink this with you, can you take the money? And that was the one time I actually managed to give him money. And then the rest, I was just like, I just gave up. So yeah, so what I've just talked about is really my own experience of doing research in Vietnam. And I think that it's such a diverse country that I don't think all of my experience is going to be applicable to like doing fieldwork in some of the other provinces.
Mhm.
However, I do think like some of the logistics in terms of applying for visas and getting permission, like I don't think it's going to be that different. Like, and in the end, I do think that all of this is really what makes fieldwork fun and kind of daunting at the same time. But I do think it's kind of worth it. So thanks, and I look very forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks so much. All right, finally, turning from within Southeast Asia to digital research, online research, we turn to Ross Tapsell.
Thanks, Meredith. Thanks, everyone. Nice to see you all here. I'm in Australia at the moment. I don't have a slides or anything. I thought I'd just talk through a short history, really, of online research methodologies. Obviously, there's a real move to online research, even if it's just one chapter of a thesis or a short journal article or one component of a research project. Increasingly, people are using the internet and digital technologies as ways to improve or gather more data or improve their research materials. And obviously the pandemic has highlighted that enormously. I'm spotlighted, I can see myself in huge big screen, so that's not at all disconcerting. Look, the move to online research is really interesting, but let me just talk through some of the ways in which we and others have managed to try and think about researching digital technologies. I guess the first thing to point out is that in the early days, there is increasingly a legacy of this, there's this stigma that online research isn't real research. It's not like the meat and potatoes of what you're supposed to be doing is this kind of cute add-on that you might do that's a bit quirky. And so I guess a lot of scholars do write about the stigma of trying to conduct a research project, which is predominantly online. I was reading this book last night, The Politics of Dating Apps. I recently bought this, haven't read the whole thing yet, but the author here in China, by the way, the author here talks about like being ridiculed by other PhD students and colleagues in the first instance, that this is my I'm going to write a book about the politics of dating apps in China. And you can understand that, in hardcore political science or say anthropology, the long legacy of being in the field, that someone who is spending their whole time online isn't considered a real scholar. But at this and the add-on to this as well is that there can sometimes be a split. Those who really dive into this and do this all the time as a big part of their research and end up being fantastic at it, leading scholars in the field of digital technologies. I'm thinking here someone like Henry Jenkins, who started out doing gaming cultures and online gaming, which is really seen as this kind of niche nerdy thing, and then ended up writing this enormously important book on convergence culture. Or there's others who are just doing like one tiny aspect in a PhD or in a research topic. But everybody agrees, no matter whether they've started out and ended up being a leader in the field, or whether they've just done it as one chapter of a book, one chapter of thesis, that it is messy. And I think Rose was talking about that earlier, that it's really a work in progress. There was a good journal article on this recently, which I'll just put into the chat here, which you can read in your own time, about private messages from the field, confessions of digital ethnography and its discomforts. And I think Crystal Aberdeen works on Singapore and internet cultures and is a great scholar to follow in this space. And you just, as we all do, we all sort of talk about it's new, things are emerging. If you're doing like research on TikTok now, everybody's still trying to figure out what TikTok is and how it works and how you might interview people from that. But the point is, I guess, is that there's still each time you start something new and the new emerging spaces, they can sometimes feel like they're a little bit discredited because it is a new space. So don't worry too much about that. And many scholars like Crystal and others would say, just dive in. And I'll quote that article at the end, just as in fact, no, I'll just quote this now because I thought it was a nice way to finish. Where she says, if you're just starting to delve into the ethnographic ways of researching digital media, if you are doubting everything you have done during your fieldwork, if you're early career scholar disillusioned by methodological cynicism and bureaucratic nonsense, let us divulge in one last intimate vulnerability and learned confidence. It is going to be okay. So hopefully, that's a positive way to think about the challenges that will ensue. But people do get around some of the challenges. Just as I said, I wanted to talk through some of the sort of recent histories. There's been a real sort of debate and trend around this idea of, okay, online research isn't real, to move to the idea that data and metrics is a source of truth. And that's a real shift that I've seen over the past 10 years. And it's been really interesting watching that. In particular, scholars have got really carried away, I think is okay to say, carried away with Twitter data. There's been a lot of research looking at big data analysis, and it's understandable, right? It's all open access. You can find whatever you want on Twitter. There's no ethical challenges really around getting information from Twitter. You can correlate and collate all of this massive information of big data research. And so big data became this source of truth and Twitter at the heart of it, which is great for some countries like the US or, Australia, to a lesser extent, UK, Europe, but it doesn't really work in the Southeast Asian context. For a while there, Twitter was booming in Jakarta, I think was the capital city, more tweets sent from any other country, any other city in the world. But Twitter has ultimately ended up being a niche, urban, middle class social media space in which, for the large part, Southeast Asians are not predominantly engaging with to the same extent that they would on Facebook, or as Ethan mentioned, on WhatsApp now, which is basically email. So Twitter was open, and that meant that scholars could get around some of these challenges around methodologies, but it wasn't great for Southeast Asia, and it's become an older platform. So I think the average age of a Twitter user is around 30 years old now, which may be not the kind of group that you're looking for. And often Twitter does reflect middle-class values. So if you're looking at Twitter as a source of truth on, say, the death penalty in Indonesia or Southeast Asia more broadly, you would find that it's mostly very much pro-death penalty, because you do get middle-class attitudes which are pro-death penalty, and it's often, the poorer people who are getting executed. So that became a problem around the use of Twitter. The other issue, of course, which some of you would know all of this, was the role of government-sponsored trolls, cyber troopers, and buzzers in the online space, but particularly Twitter. The data ended up becoming manipulated. And so Twitter, while once becoming this great source of truth around big data and metrics and quantitative analysis, now is highly skewed because of the role of disinformation actors. There was a great series out just recently on Inside Indonesia on the role of buzzers in Indonesia, where they interviewed buzzers, which I'll talk to later. So now we're sort of at the point where, well, if you've written a journal article or a chapter in your PhD only using Twitter data, to what extent can we really see it as not just representative, because it never was truly representative of online opinion, but how much of it is just skewed by paid and manipulated forces? The other move that we've seen in the online spaces is the yearning, I guess, for specific forms of data from social media companies. And this has been a really interesting debate in the last 5 years, as Facebook has started to pay researchers via their Facebook grants. And there was this sort of elite yearning, angst, or desire by academics to be part of the elite group that got money from Facebook to get exclusive data from Facebook to then publish their research in open access journals. But it was this tying into the neoliberal university, the idea that you were collaborating with industry, the idea that you were bringing in external funding, the idea that you could get exclusive use of data, and all of this was a fantastic thing. And scholars have now started to think about this, and especially when Facebook doesn't deliver on the data that they promise, but also the nature of industry collaboration, which is meant to be a good thing, according to the vice chancellors and the deans and so on. But to what extent should we be collaborating with some of these social media platforms, particularly in the wake, of course, of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, which originally came from researchers, using Facebook in order to gather information. So there's now really strong ethical questions about the role that researchers should play and the trustworthiness, I guess, of researchers, and the way in which Facebook might push researchers in certain directions, funding some projects but not others, in order to help out a billion-dollar company on taxpayer dollars, which is essentially what's happening, right? When researchers are getting money, at public universities to do research for a private company. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that there is now a real debate around what kind of exclusive access is a good thing. So you might automatically think, oh, wouldn't it be great if Facebook gave me all this data? If I could just connect to Facebook in Singapore or Jakarta or Manila and talk to the people there and see if they can give me some data. But I would very much caution against that kind of approach, which was actually quite popular for a while there. The final issue I wanted to bring up was, as we've moved from Twitter and open access stuff and open data to Facebook and sort of public groups on Facebook and trying to get data from Facebook, now the real discussion in the field is around closed groups. And as the government has started to push ideas of cracking down on open stuff on the internet, obviously everybody's moving to closed groups. So it's really interesting to think about how can you get data on closed groups like WhatsApp groups and Facebook closed groups. QUT had Emma Balch and Amelia Johns had a good one on Malaysia recently. I've done some stuff on the election, looking at closed groups on WhatsApp. It's a really interesting debate about to what extent should you declare if you're in a chat, hello, my name's Ross Tapsell, I'm in this WhatsApp group, I'm using this material as part of research, or I'm reading this material as part of a research project, and some of these groups, 256 people, it wouldn't really work out that way. Obviously, you would keep everything anonymous, but, to what extent should you declare your intentions is very much a current debate in the field. And that, again, as I think Rose mentioned, this case-by-case basis is really important. I'm thinking of, say, Navan Nurunia's research, where she was looking at terrorist groups on WhatsApp and the conversations that female participants were having and how they get recruited into terrorist groups. You obviously can't say, well, I'm monitoring this to use it for research. But also increasingly on disinformation, right? You're trying to find bad actors and you can't be out there declaring that you are looking at this kind of research in order to not necessarily expose, but to understand the way that these bad actors work. So this is a big challenge, but it's an increasingly important discussion to have. How do you engage with closed social media groups? And to what extent is it ethical to use any of that material, as part of your research project? And it obviously is different if it's a PhD, because you really have to explain everything in your methodology. And PhDs I'm reading in this space, they're really thick in their methodology, really talking you through every step of the process. But equally, it is important for all forms of research. So I hope that's given you an outline. I'll stop there so we can have plenty of time for questions, but I hope that gives you an outline of where the field is going and where it's heading.
Thanks so much. All right, so we're open to questions now. As I said at the beginning, feel free either to raise your digital hand, just because I can't see everybody at once, and unmute yourself and ask a question, or you can post questions in the chat. While people think of questions, I will just mention that we have another panel this Friday on building a career on Southeast Asia as a Southeast Asian in the US. That'll be Friday at 10 a.m. EK Tan, who's here, will be moderating that panel. And we'll have a set of fantastic panelists again to talk about really these questions of identity as it intersects with research and with building a career. So questions. All right, I see Jinhee Lim, sorry.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it better if I turn on the camera or is it just up to me?
It's nice to see you speaking, but it's okay if you prefer not to.
Let me turn on the camera. Hello, my name is Jin or Jinhee, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Oxford. I'm a first year studying geography and the environment, and my research is on the stateless people in northern Thailand. And I would like to ask, are there any specificities in working with or working on the very sensitive topic of the stateless people and ethnic minorities, especially considering that they all speak languages other than the standardized Thai? So ways of approaching very specific interpreters, and so if there are any general tips that you can give me, I would really appreciate that. Thank you so much. And thank you for the session.
Oh, sure, thanks. Okay, Rose.
Yeah, so Jen, your research sounds really interesting and important. I was really struck listening to the presentations about Indonesia and Vietnam, how different my research experience was in Thailand and Myanmar. That level of scrutiny and surveillance, I did not experience. So Thailand does have a research authority that you're supposed to apply to get permission. I didn't do that when I was doing my research because I was counseled that they would not give permission to do research on a population, a stateless population, basically my Burmese refugees I was working with and exiles, and many of them were not living in refugee camps, but were in the country illegally or semi-legally. And so I didn't want to draw attention to them by saying, I'm doing research on these people, they're here. So I went on a tourist visa and I extended that tourist visa several times. And I think that's quite common, both for people who are living in Thailand for extended periods for various reasons. And the authorities kind of, they're aware that this happens. They can see in your passport that you've been there for like years. And at certain times they've like implemented these restrictions like, oh, you have to leave now for like a month before you can come back again. But it's been, I think the enforcement has been a little inconsistent, partly because Thailand's economy is so dependent on foreigners who do live in Thailand for extended periods for various reasons. So I would do further research and kind of feel out the current situation, because I made this decision, more than 10 years ago, and it may be that the situation has changed and that the research authority in Thailand is different now. But I did have a colleague, Amanda Flame, who's really wonderful and who's now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I believe, but she did research in partnership with like UN agencies on stateless people. And she found that that was a way to do it because she was partnering with them. Whereas my research was very much like on my own. I was partnering with local organizations run by people from Myanmar, but not a large body such as the UN. So I think you have various options. And I don't know if you have follow-up questions, but I'd be curious to hear what others think.
Thank you so much.
Great. Did other panelists want to jump in on that? Okay. All right, then great. Thanks. All right, Olivia Meyer.
Hi, I'm a PhD student in geography at the University of Hawaii, and I study plastic waste in Thailand. This question is for any of the speakers, but I was wondering if you had kind of tips for how to approach initial contact with community organizations that you might want to partner with, I know that Rose mentioned like what questions do you all have that you might want answered, asking things like that. But just in that kind of trying to do more reciprocal work, I would love tips on that. And then also like, how do you approach these kind of relationship building conversations virtually versus in the like quote unquote field? Thanks.
So I'll have the panelists, any of you can jump in on this, and we'll go one question at a time just because they may be on such different topics, if that's okay. Okay, so who wants to start?
Just a general, so it's obviously always helpful if you can have kind of referrals from, so if you start with, maybe one of your professors or someone else who, has like one even tangentially relevant contact, maybe it's just a professor at a local university or a larger NGO, you could chat with them generally first, tell them about your interests, and then ask if they would recommend more relevant people who they might be able to put you in contact with. And you can kind of snowball your contacts from contacts of contacts. But it's great to, really allow your research focus to be shaped by what people on the ground think is important. And I would definitely allocate a lot of time in your kind of research trajectory to do that. Like for me, I spent a year in Ann Arbor writing my prospectus before going to Indonesia, and well, after I had been to Indonesia once, but then after I was there and started engaging more in depth on some things, I realized that some of the details, just didn't make any sense at all. And had I actually spent a few more weeks talking to people on the ground, they would have told me, yeah, that doesn't really make sense, or that's not that interesting or relevant in the context. Instead, why don't you think about this or this or this? So it's great to lean on local expertise of local researchers, activists, NGOs, and try to make those connections early. And I think often people it depends obviously on the person. I haven't done research in Thailand, but I think a lot of people like helping people doing research, PhD students. So I found people to be pretty generous, but I also think ethically it is good if you can be reciprocal and always follow up with your contacts, update them on how things are going, send them results of your research in ways that are easy to digest, and keep connected, keep those relationships alive. Don't just message someone one off and then never follow up. So it can be a lot, but try to maintain contacts, and definitely work collaboratively with, which it sounds like you're planning on doing, which is great, with local partners.
Just to quickly piggyback on that, I know these days it's kind of difficult, but one way is to kind of follow them on social media. Like, for instance, if they have a Facebook page, or in Vietnam, Facebook is a really big thing, and most people kind of have a Facebook page. So you can kind of track and see if they have any events that are going on, and then you can go to the event and introduce yourself. And that's usually easier. At least from what I've experienced, I've managed to get contacts that way and establish relationships with them, and kind of like what was just said, developing that sort of personal relationship is also very important, I think. And my experience of doing research in Asia really shows that, I think the professional and the personal, the line is pretty much not really there. So yeah, I hope that helps.
Yeah, I would just add quickly that I think most of the people who participated in my research, I knew first, not as a researcher. They knew me sort of as a volunteer teacher or as someone who worked with their organization. And I think that might not be possible in your situation, but I wonder if you could do some kind of digital internship with an organization where you, edited their documents that they want to publish in English, or whatever service you can provide. And then it's I think, at least I've experienced a lot of hesitance to researchers who are I'm here, everybody should now open up and, tell me their personal stories and do all this. I think foregrounding what we can offer instead of what we want to take can be helpful. And it sounds like you're already thinking about doing that.
Okay, Ross, did you want to jump into or no?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got some PhD students who, during the pandemic, have been trying to get interviews via Zoom and Facebook, and it's been really hard for them, to be fair. Like you're right, Melody, in that, there's this sort of gray area between the personal and professional, but I think it's certainly on issues like politics and disinformation, it's really hard to get people to say things online, even if you don't record it, but of course for PhD students, you want to record it, but even just to get them lined up on a Zoom chat to talk about this stuff, it's a huge challenge, and they've been finding it really hard. And a cold approaching people via social media, I think possibly a lot of those days have gone. I think there's a movement now to be very wary of people approaching, including foreign scholars. Having a public social media profile can help. I think I've found that relative useful, is why I use Twitter. I know that sometimes people might just try and look at Twitter. Okay, is this guy a real scholar, and not a CIA operative or something? Okay, this looks kind of legit. So that can help. But I do think it has been a really challenging 2 years for this kind of work.
Great. Okay. In the interest of time, we'll move on to the next question. Prajakta.
Hi, I'm a PhD student in political science at the University of Florida. I have a question for Dr. Metro. So can you talk about doing archival research in Myanmar? So are there public libraries that have information and records about military? Because my research interest is civil military relations. So do they have information about that? And more importantly, do they allow outsiders to access that information when we go there?
I don't have that much experience doing archival research in Myanmar, but I do sense that if that material were available, the military, especially right now, would have basically no interest in showing that to a researcher or granting access to it. I would suggest that it might be better to find those records, try to find them outside Myanmar. There are several universities that have really well-developed Southeast Asia libraries. Cornell is one, and I'm familiar with it because that was my institution, but I can't say like it definitely wouldn't happen because I've never tried to do that, but I would be very surprised if there were anyone in the military, especially at a military library or something, who would be willing to grant you access to that kind of material.
Okay, thank you.
I will say that actually Mary Callahan, in her book Making Enemies, at the very beginning of that, she actually talks, or maybe it's the preface, I can't remember. She talks about her process of getting access to those materials, and it was somewhat by chance. There was a fax machine involved. It was unexpected. So that just, she might be another person perhaps to contact, but yeah. And then the other thing I will say is that if it's something from earlier on, especially, I know from doing archival research on Singapore and Malaysia, a lot of stuff that I can't get, especially in Malaysia, is in the UK. So even after the end of colonialism, there's still quite detailed records, which are probably less complete for Myanmar or for Burma, just because of the extent to which the country withdrew. But at the same time, as a former colony, you might be able to find some useful materials there. Okay, great. Let me see, I'm just checking the chat. Okay. Oh, and there's some useful links. So anyone here should feel free to put things in the chat if you have useful links, sources, and so forth. And then we have time for probably 1 or 2 more questions. And if there's not one from the floor, I'll ask one, but I'd rather defer to the floor. And I should say also, if there's somebody who is here, okay, and Clarice will come to you in just a second. If there's somebody who's here who has something that you would like to contribute, feel free as well. We can, at this point, our last 10 minutes, be a little less formal. All right, Clarice.
Hi, thank you for the great discussion and sharing. My question is for Dr. Ross Tapsell. I'm an MA student in sociology at the University of Hawaii, and I'm actually planning to study disinformation in Indonesia. And I'm actually wondering, what are the ethics of establishing your first point of contact through, say, social media connections? So for example, like through Twitter or Facebook, or even through some of the WhatsApp messaging group. And then, like if I am interested in how they are translating their social media engagements to a more real life context. So I'm interested in how they're interacting with their families, their communities offline. What are the ethics of, trying to know more about that side of their social worldview?
Yeah, that's a great question, Clarice. Yeah, and really there's no easy answer on something like that. It really does depend on, what groups and how you're going to go about it. And there's so many variables in all of that it's sort of, hard to give a really good conclusive answer, other than to say that, disinformation research is in many ways a new field, because we're trying to establish, and most people are doing mixed methodology. So a lot of people are trying to get some form of online materials, but also speak, directly to a player in some capacity. So often the way I've found to do it would be to just start with off the record sort of conversations with these kind of people, and to develop a relationship first, and to see whether that also they like talking to me, because a lot of disinformation researchers do see themselves as digital entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurship in the digital space is a very Southeast Asia is a fantastic place for that. It's often undervalued. We often think about Silicon Valley as being, the place for digital technologies, but actually in some of these, say, political campaigning, advertising, practices like of digital labor, Southeast Asia is at the forefront of this. So a lot of them do want to talk, but they don't want to say that they're trying to manipulate elections, but they do want to talk about how they think about an audience, how they think about the role of social media in a democracy, how they think about the nature of digital labor, like are they fairly paid? And often a lot of them will say they are, and it's a great part-time gig that they do, as well as being a university student, or as well as their what we would see as more legitimate forms of digital labor. They do this other stuff on the side. They will often talk about other firms. So it's very easy to get people talking about other people in their field that do this kind of thing, rather than specifically trying to get them to talk about their own, sort of, without getting too personal and too detailed in what they're doing and their particular political candidate. Like speaking broadly first, I find really helps. And this is always a massive challenge when journalists contact me. I get calls from American journalists all the time asking for contacts in the disinformation space. Hey, Ross, can you give me a contact to, a Philippine troll who's campaigning for Duterte? And, I'll be like, no, because they trust me, and they trust that when I talk to them, I will represent their sort of digital labor practice more broadly and anonymously. And they don't want to talk to an LA Times journal or something about, and who's going to inevitably write a story of, Duterte trolls exposed, and here were my 3 sources that I got. So I think it is about respecting the nature of their work in some respects. So that's one thing I've been thinking a lot as you try and get information. But yeah, on the online space, as I said, it's really hard to try to approach people via Facebook or Twitter. They're very wary of saying anything online which could be screenshot and published and used or sent to Facebook. I'll finish now, Meredith, I promise. But one of the big practices of disinformation is to report other actors, political campaigners, to Facebook. So yeah, it's where they're wary of saying anything online, basically. I hope that answers part of your question. It's a massive challenge, but feel free to shoot me an email later.
Any other questions before I pose this one final one? I will say, just as people think about whether you want to ask something, as you could see, it's surprisingly difficult to get information on how, for many countries, on how to go about doing research, or what's accessible and what's not, or who to talk to, or how to do these things. So I would encourage, especially those of you who are PhD students or early in your career, some of this stuff also gets easier, correctly or not, later in your career, because you find workarounds, or you're known, or you get a university affiliation that sort of saves some of the hassle. So it means that, like, some of, if you're a PhD student, you may find that your supervisor really is not very helpful on how to get a visa just because of the timing or the processes change over time. So I really encourage you, the AAS, Association for Asian Studies, or the ASA, I'm sure as well, the different sub-regional, like the Malaysia, Singapore, Brunei study group has a newsletter. The Indonesia and East Timor study group also publishes things. Those are great spaces in which to just write up, this is how I got my visa. It's a great line in your CV, but it's also so incredibly helpful. I mean, like seeing Eitan's slides or just, I want to be able to hand those to future students, although it may change. So just keep that in mind that like, it's really helpful. A lot of this is knowledge passed down over time. And especially since so few people have been able to get out in the field for those pre-dissertation trips on which you sometimes discover this information, it's been hard to make some of those connections. So please share. All right. The last question I will pose, since I'm not seeing a hand, which if each of the panelists can give maybe 1 minute, it picks up on something Melody mentioned and Eitan mentioned, which is the questions of your own position as a researcher. So this is an unfair question to ask you to respond to in 1 minute, but it's a nice segue to Friday's panel as well. So Melody mentioned issues of gender. Eitan mentioned issues of being, an obvious white person. Class can feature, especially, Ross mentioned that in terms of online media. Rose mentioned some of these dimensions as well. So your top tip or two or takeaway in a minute for each. We'll go in the same order. So Rose, then Eitan, then Melody, then Ross.
I would just say, pay attention to your discomfort. If there's something that makes you uncomfortable in your research process, think about why that is. Because there are different junctures that have been really important for me. For instance, when I was about to pass out consent forms and I was like, I can't do this. Like, I can't ask these people to sign this form. They don't understand it. Like, even though it's translated, and had I overlooked that and been like, I'm just going to push through and keep going, I think I really could have damaged my relationships with my participants.
One thing I would say is having research assistants or partners there with you can be really helpful in navigating and making the space more comfortable to the participants. And also think about the identity of the people that you're working with and how that can affect things. So I actually worked with my main research assistant is ethnically Chinese, which is, a minority in Indonesia. And he was also seen as an outsider in places, but that said, he, happened to be the most qualified person. And I didn't want to discriminate against him in my hiring process. But in other circumstances, having Javanese, I was, researching in Javanese people with me, women for meetings with women, can be really helpful, and recognizing, that people are not going to share always the same things with me, particularly, women talking about gender issues, for example, as they will, with a woman, someone who they're more comfortable with. So I think recognizing limitations in your positionality and trying partnerships with, local researchers can also help potentially overcome some of that.
Yeah, I agree that having an assistant is really helpful in those situations, because I remember one time my assistant was just like, you need to stop drinking, because you need to be careful. She didn't know my tolerance, but then she was always reminding me that, you don't need to do this. You're a foreigner, you don't have to conform to everything, and they will just kind of, they will just kind of accept it because you're a foreigner, you're not one of us. So I think there are times that I just wish I was Vietnamese so I could just be like them. But at the same time, in situations like these, actually not being Vietnamese was kind of helpful.
Oh, look, for me, the thing I sweat about is the idea of the local research collaborations, and not because I don't think they can be great, but it's the danger that local collaborators face. And that can include, professors and other scholars. And as Eitan was talking about, the laws are now saying you should collaborate, you should co-publish. And on the surface, that seems great, right? It's great for an ANU academic to be collaborating and publishing with an University of Indonesia, but you're writing about disinformation, about buzzers, about politics, and I just find it hard to take the risks that I would ordinarily take as a sole author with some of these research collaborators, knowing that there will be crackdowns on them, and also, so some of them, you know, would want to do it to further their career, or they want to please me, and it's and you know, we know of stories of you know, intelligence people and military and others, you know, and I've written about this in the journalistic field, where it's often the Indonesian assistant or local authority that gets arrested or hassled or, you know, pressured. So I just don't have a good answer for that, but I do think that it's a huge challenge in this space of greater research collaboration in Southeast Asia, and the rules sort of enforcing that. I think part of the reason why the rules enforce that is because they think they'll have more power. The governments and authorities think they can have more control over what researchers write, and how do we navigate that?
Terrific.
Sorry.
Yeah, go on.
I was going to say this, but I forgot. But for those of us who are historians in the room, like, I think we are not subjected to the same IRB process. And so I was very lucky because I didn't have to go through any of that. And basically, I'm just saying it's all my observations and interviews. So yeah, like, it makes it a little easier to protect the subjects.
Great. I would also, again, recommend the pieces that Rose posted, and just the thought process that those provoke in terms of really thinking through ethics, not just in terms of what the IRB says, but in terms of what you know as a researcher really matters most. In other words, that yes, you don't want to do obviously duplicitous or whatever things, but that there's much more nuance to the practice of ethical research. And as a couple, I think Clarice had the question toward the end as well, on how that all then translates into online research is really complex as well. So on that inconclusive note, just a couple minutes over time, I would like to effusively thank our panelists. This was incredibly helpful, and thanks to all of you for attending, and I hope to see a lot of you on Friday.